1968 was an election year, and by the summer of '67, anti-war Democrats are already looking for a challenger to LBJ. Bobby Kennedy says no. He refuses to run, even though he's come out against the war. And so the anti-war Democrats turn to Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, extreme liberal. His young supporters are enthusiastic, and they make the New Hampshire primary close. Bobby Kennedy sees an opportunity for an anti-war candidate, and he decides to enter the race. He joins his support from minorities. The Kennedys are very popular for supporting the civil rights movement, with his support from labor, traditional allies of the Kennedys, as well with this new support from the anti-war movement. And Bobby Kennedy is winning big in the polls in 1968. Before the Wisconsin primary, LBJ makes a shocking announcement on March 31st.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Is LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who steps into the race when LBJ drops out. LBJ also, by the way, says he will stop the bombing of North Vietnam in that same speech. And many people have come to believe that the war is ending, that it's over. But Humphrey steps in and becomes kind of the mainstream Democratic candidate. But he's losing badly in every poll to Bobby Kennedy. Due to the caucus system, Humphrey appears that he's going to end up being the nominee, even though he has the support of only a minority of Democratic voters. The country is shocked in the middle of all this on April 4th of 1968 when Martin Luther King is killed in Memphis while supporting striking sanitation workers. The assassin, James Earl Ray, is caught 2 months later in London and claims he had been hired to do it, but he won't say by whom. There's tremendous grief and anger across the country among both white supporters and, of course, African Americans. And tragically, and really a terrible legacy to everything Martin Luther King stood for, riots break out in over 60 cities across America, and 43 are killed. Martin Luther King eerily and cryptically gives this powerful speech the very night before he dies.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
On June 6th, just a couple of months later, Bobby Kennedy is killed by an assassin after winning the California primary. He's gunned down by the Palestinian Sirhan Sirhan, and it cast a pall over the whole primary in the election. With Bobby Kennedy dead, Hubert Humphrey is really the only candidate left, but the party is still divided. There are those who support an anti-war plank. Hubert Humphrey supports the war because, of course, he was part of the LBJ administration that had promoted it. And then in the 1968 Democratic Convention, we have something amazing. We have basically a fight break out, both a debate inside the convention, but protesters outside the convention in Grant Park in Chicago. They're brutally put down by the Democratic Mayor Daley while Hubert Humphrey is being nominated. So if you're watching this at home, the news cameras are cutting between scenes of Hubert Humphrey accepting the Democratic Party nomination and Democrats really out in the park being severely beaten because they oppose what the Democrats are doing. Daley uses tear gas and billy clubs. Hundreds are injured, and it's all televised on TV. The protesters in the park will chant, "The whole world is watching," and they're right. Humphrey had spent his whole life aspiring to the nomination. He was one of the first politicians to speak out on behalf of ending segregation in this country. And by the time he finally gets his dream, the nomination of his party for president, it's essentially worthless. turbulence and radicalism of 1968 scare most Americans, and many revert into kind of a conservative shell. Richard Nixon, we don't know at the time, but we find out later, will use his operatives to encourage and help fund the presidential campaign of Alabama Governor George Wallace. He's a hero to racists. He's the guy who blocked the door of Alabama. He said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he runs as a Democrat, but he's really a Dixiecrat, in 1968, splitting the party. His platform calls for an end to busing to desegregate schools, an end to government regulation, and a return to the days of segregation. He opposes the rights of the accused, which is often seen as protecting minorities. And he runs on that law and order platform that Barry Goldwater had first spelled out in 1964. He polls high. In fact, he polls as high as 20% at times. And so the Democrats will be split, with the Southerners tending to follow Wallace and the rest of the Democrats tending to follow, unhappily I might add, Hubert Humphrey. The Republicans will turn to Richard Nixon, the old Cold Warrior, Red Scare figure, the former senator and vice president under Eisenhower, and the losing candidate in the 1960 election. He had retired after losing the California governor's race in 1962. He would say, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. But when he sees a path to winning the White House in 68, he re-enters politics. And what he does is he gets Wallace to run to split the Southern vote away from the Democrats. And he begins to use what are called dog whistles or code words to talk about racism that doesn't sound like he's talking about it. He talks about his silent majority who supports states' rights. Well, what state right is he talking about? Well, the right to segregate, of course. He uses that phrase, law and order. And you got to think, at the time of these demonstrations and these protests, the cops were the ones fighting against the black guys. The cops are beating Martin Luther King and John Lewis and the other civil rights leaders and throwing them in jail. So when you say we have to support our police, you're saying we have to support our police against the protesters. That's what law and order means. And he talks about a peace with honor in Vietnam. He says he has a secret plan to end the war and victory in Vietnam. The split Democratic Party hands Nixon a narrow victory, and this is seen as a rejection of reform and one of these return to normalcies like we saw with the election of Harding. But that's not what we're going to get. I do have to leave one quote with you to make this perfectly clear that I'm not making this up. This is a quote from Nixon's campaign strategist, Kevin Phillips, explaining Nixon's strategy to win the election. He says, from now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangements with the local Democrats. So what they're saying is, we want black Democratic voters going and voting because then white Southern racists will refuse to be in the same party with them and will join the Republican Party. And it flips that solid Democratic South that had been solid since before the Civil War into a solid Republican voting bloc that's going to develop post-Nixon's election in 1968.